The forest is awake. What time is it where you are? And from where do you listen? Subscribe and hear what hides in the dark. I knew this trip was going to be different the moment we rolled up to that campsite. The place was massive. So big that before we arrived, nobody had fully mapped it out. Normally we do a thorough sweep to mark any hazards and figure out where mischievous kids might wander. This time the size alone made that impossible, and it put me on edge. The kids, of course, found it all thrilling. They asked a million questions, buzzing with that bright-eyed energy that only comes from fresh air and the promise of running around unsupervised. Well, mostly unsupervised. We pitched our tents in a clearing that looked reasonably safe, at least by daylight. The biggest worry I had at the time was a random root or hole someone might trip over. Still, something gnawed at me. I'd catch glimpses of movement at the edge of my vision, shadows dancing just beyond the tree line. Once or twice, I turned too quickly, expecting to see an animal darting away, but nothing. I told myself I was just tired, or maybe feeling jumpy about the unknown. That evening, we gathered the kids to explain our big tradition, the night game. Typical camp scarefest. Each adult leader dons some haphazard monster costume, positions themselves along the designated path, and leaps out at unsuspecting 8 to 10-year-olds. You know, the kind of thing that always gets them shrieking, then giggling like crazy. But as I handed out flashlights and set the ground rules, like, absolutely don't leave the trail unless you want to end up lost for hours, I felt my nerves cranking up another notch. I tried to hide it behind a grin. I chose this open patch of forest to do my part. It was ideal for breaking into a sprint whenever I spotted a group approaching, barely any underbrush or brambles. But with no bushes or rocks to hide behind, I had to switch off my flashlight or risk blowing my cover. The darkness there felt thicker somehow, almost suffocating. Several times I swore I saw a figure my size slip between the trees. Each time I flicked on my light, expecting to catch one of the other leaders pulling a fast one on me. Not once did I see a single soul. Right when I was about ready to call it a night, I glimpsed someone near a large trunk. At first, relief rushed through me. Finally, I'd caught my prankster in the act. I flipped on the beam to let them know they were busted. But what the light showed was all wrong. Whoever stood there wore a tattered burlap sack, stained dark in patches, and had a bunch of plastic bags wrapped around their head like a makeshift hood. The person's arms and legs were caked in dried mud, and there was this repeated sound like a gentle knocking. It took me a second to realize he was tapping his forehead into the tree trunk, over and over. I tried calling out. Maybe it was a messed up costume or somebody fooling around. But he didn't answer. He just paused that head tapping and turned in my direction, taking a slow, deliberate step toward me. Something told me this was no friend. My whole body launched into action before my mind fully processed what was happening. I tore away from that clearing, branches snapping under my shoes, leaves rustling as I barreled through like a runaway train. Anytime I thought I was safe, I heard footfalls behind me, quick and heavy. I refused to look back. I was convinced if I did, I'd run straight into a tree or fall face first into the dirt. The only thought rattling around in my head was, get back to camp, get to the others, get to the light. When I burst into the campfire glow, the other leaders stared at me like I was out of my mind. They were all accounted for, masks off, sipping water, looking as calm as ever. I could barely catch my breath. No one else seemed winded, let alone coated in filth or wearing anything like that hideous burlap getup. They tried reassuring me, saying maybe I'd just spotted a trick of moonlight, or a wandering camper from another group. As much as I wanted to believe that, I knew I'd seen something. It was enough to keep me up half the night, ears straining for any sound that hinted we weren't alone in that massive stretch of forest. The morning came way too early. I dragged myself out of my sleeping bag, half expecting to see the rest of the group gossiping about my late-night meltdown. But most of them were already busy corralling the kids for breakfast. Nobody was pointing fingers or making jokes, yet. Still, I knew I couldn't just brush off what happened. Maybe there was a dangerous stranger out there, a lost hiker who needed help, or something worse. I cornered one of the other leaders, A friend who'd known me long enough to trust I wasn't making up tall tales. I laid it all out. The ragged burlap, the plastic around the head, the frantic chase through the trees. Her eyes got bigger with every detail, and I could see a flicker of worry replace her usual calm. We decided to sneak off after the kids were occupied with arts and crafts. No sense in alerting them, or risking a full-blown panic. Walking back into the woods felt like stepping into a different world. In daylight, the place looked calmer, but I still couldn't shake the tension winding itself around my nerves. Every snapped twig made me jerk my head around. Every brush of a branch against my sleeve had me bracing to run again. My friend tried to keep conversation light, talking about mundane stuff just to fill the silence. But my focus was on that clearing, the exact spot where I'd seen him. When we finally found the tree, I recognized it by a jagged chunk of bark near the base, a detail I'd noticed only because I'd briefly shown my flashlight there the night before. There weren't obvious footprints or signs of a struggle, which was odd considering all the thrashing around I'd done. For a second, I worried I'd dragged my friend out here for nothing, letting my own nerves spin a wild story. But then we spotted it. A rabbit nailed to the trunk, skinned and rotting in the heat. The stench was indescribable, some foul mix of decay and dried blood. My friend recoiled, swearing softly under her breath. I felt like my insides twisted into a knot. Anyone who'd do something like that wasn't just a prankster with a sick sense of humor. They were straight up disturbing. We called the police using the camp's ancient radio phone, which crackled so badly I had to repeat myself 3 times. Eventually, 2 officers rolled up, neither looking thrilled about trudging into the woods. We showed them the gruesome scene, half expecting them to share our alarm. Instead, they shrugged and suggested it might be some teenagers from a nearby town or rival scouting group playing a gross joke. They took a couple of photos, wrote a few notes, and promised to look into it. For the rest of the day, I couldn't focus on anything else. I helped the kids make nature collages and watched them run relay races, always keeping an ear out for odd sounds beyond the tree line. Every rustle of branches had me on edge, imagining burlap and plastic lurking just out of sight. The other leaders noticed my jumpiness but didn't press. Maybe they sensed how seriously rattled I was. No more sightings came. No screeching from a stranger in the woods. No footprints leading into our camp. Part of me felt relief, but another part grew more uneasy, wondering where that person went, and if they'd resurface when we least expected it. That final night none of us slept well, though we did our best to pretend we were just excited to go home. As we packed the vans the next morning, the kids were all smiles, talking about their favorite memories, s'mores, night games, bunking together under a star-studded sky. I plastered on a grin, offering encouraging nods every time they asked if we'd be back soon. But in the back of my mind, the image of that skinned rabbit and the person wrapped in plastic lingered. It was like a warning, etched into my thoughts. Some places hide things in their deepest corners that no one should ever stumble upon. Even when we finally drove away, I couldn't relax. Every bump in the road echoed with the possibility of something sinister. We left the forest behind, but I had this gnawing certainty that whatever lurked there wasn't done roaming its territory. And I promised myself that if I ever found out what, or who, it was, I'd be a whole lot more prepared next time. I always used to roll my eyes at ghost stories and all those things that go bump in the night. Growing up in a small Utah town, though, you start to realize that the landscape can play tricks on you. My house sat right where the building stopped and the wilderness began. Beyond our backyard fence was just this enormous field, stretching on forever until the desert touched distant mountains. On some days, you could see dust devils spinning across the flat earth like they had a mind of their own. Living there felt like living at the boundary between normal life and the unknown. My best friend lived next door, though next door was really just across a patch of wild grass. Our homes formed the last 2 spots of civilization on this lonely street, which ended in an empty cul-de-sac. As far as anyone could tell, the town had planned to expand at some point, but they never got around to it, so the cul-de-sac sat forgotten, half carved into the dirt. It was high school, and I spent more time at my friend's place than my own. His basement was our hideout, a tattered old couch, a TV that barely worked, and a mini fridge usually stocked with soda and leftovers. The window well in that basement was the only view outside, but it was a comfort. Until nights fell, and it turned into a black void that made us both feel uneasy. Every so often, we'd be in the middle of a late-night gaming marathon when a noise drifted through that window. A slow, scraping shuffle, mixed with something like a gargling cough. The first time it happened, we paused the game, stared at each other, and thought maybe it was just the wind blowing trash around. Then it happened again, another night, and it started to feel too deliberate to be the wind. Neither of us had the nerve to walk upstairs and fling open the back door, so we just sat there, telling each other it had to be animals, or who knows what. But there was a tension growing between us. Neither of us believed the excuses. We tried shining flashlights through the glass once. Nothing jumped out, but the beam caught hints of movement, the kind that makes you question if your eyes are messing with you. The next morning, we looked for tracks in the mud, convinced we'd find some stray dog's footprints, or maybe raccoon tracks, something normal. But the ground was smooth, disturbed only by random patches of weeds. That was when the question lodged itself in my brain. If there was nothing back there, what made the noise? Time wore on, and the weird occurrences became part of our routine. Like how you eventually stop reacting to a house settling in the middle of the night. We kept living our lives, shrugging it off as coincidence. But each time I headed home through that empty field, the air felt heavy, as if the dusty ground was concealing a secret just out of sight. When the wind blew across those low bushes, it sounded more like hushed whispers than just leaves rustling. My friend was getting ready to move soon. His parents were taking him to another part of the state. We spent our last few weeks of freedom soaking up every bit of fun we could. A nagging voice in my head told me something was looming, like the field itself was waiting for the perfect moment to prove us right about our fears. The final days felt electric, as if the nights had gotten darker and the quiet had grown a little too thick. We were both on edge, though we hardly admitted it. One evening, I stepped out onto his back porch to grab something from the truck, and the sight of the empty cul-de-sac struck me in a way it never had before. The street lamp at the end of the road was broken, leaving that corner in pitch-black darkness. There was a feeling, almost like the darkness was crawling closer, pressing on the edges of our property. I hurried back inside, acting like I was just cold, but really, I couldn't stand being out there any longer than I had to. Little did I know, that creeping sense of dread was only the beginning. There were still more odd happenings to come, nights of uneasy sleep and half-imagined shapes at the window. I tried to laugh it off, but that place had a hold on me. It was like an ancient desert creature, biding its time, letting the moonless nights build an atmosphere of tension that no amount of logical thinking could dismantle. And if I'd known what was waiting for us on the other side of that pitch-black field, I might have never left that basement at all. I had no idea how quickly things could escalate until the night my friend and I decided to go for one last drive through that dusty cul-de-sac. He was days away from moving, and we were both restless. The thought of staying in that basement had started making my stomach churn, so we figured a bit of fresh air might calm our nerves, or at least distract us. We climbed into his old truck around midnight, cranking the engine in the kind of silence only broken by our jittery breathing. When we pulled out of the driveway, we flicked on the high beams, and I spotted a rabbit darting off into the field. That tiny movement reminded me how alive the darkness could be. We turned the wheel toward the empty roundabout, thinking we'd make a quick loop back onto the main street. That stretch of pavement was practically abandoned. No lights, no houses, just a half circle of asphalt leading into a wall of brush and sage. As soon as the headlights cut across the dirt, we both locked onto something hunched low in the beam. At first, my eyes struggled to make sense of the shape. It looked vaguely human, but not quite. Pale limbs jutted out at angles that didn't seem right, each joint too long, too gaunt. And the skin, thin and almost translucent, clung to its frame like it had been plastered on. Neither of us spoke. The truck idled, headlights illuminating this figure in a stark white glow. Every cell in my body begged me to blink, to look away, but I couldn't. The thing's head swiveled toward us, revealing an open mouth stretched far beyond normal. It reminded me of a snake dislocating its jaw, except there was no visible tongue, no teeth I could make out, just a dark hollow. Then there were the eyes, black and almost reflective, as if they soaked up the truck's headlights. A bolt of panic shot through me. The thing jerked backward, contorting itself in a way that defied simple physics. It zipped into the brush, almost as if someone had hit rewind. We stayed put, gripping the wheel and the passenger seat, trying to piece together what we'd just seen. That half second felt like it lasted an hour, and yet the moment was gone before we could react. My friend slammed the truck into reverse. There was no debate, no words exchanged. He just gunned it. We tore out of that cul-de-sac, gravel spraying against the undercarriage. The whole time, I had this urge to twist around and check the rear window. I was too afraid of seeing another glimpse of that pale form lunging after us. When we made it back to his place, we jumped out of the truck and sprinted inside. Neither of us wasted time fumbling with the lights. We flipped on every switch we could reach, checking windows, peering through the blinds. The house felt too quiet, like the air had been drained out of the rooms. We double-locked the back door and huddled in the basement, the place that had once been our cozy refuge, now feeling like a bunker. For hours we just sat there, occasionally whispering possibilities. Was it a person, starving and sick? Some kind of animal with mange? But none of that explained the unnatural angles of its limbs, or the gaping jaw that looked like a black pit. At one point, I thought I heard a shuffling noise above us, but I couldn't be certain if it was just the house settling, or my imagination running wild. We kept the TV on low, more for noise than anything else, but every so often we'd mute it, convinced something outside had moved. We never could bring ourselves to open the basement window, even though part of me wanted to check that empty field and see if it was still lurking. Caution won out. I wasn't in a hurry to come face to face with that creature again. Eventually, the sun started to rise, leaking weak orange light into the basement. The moment we saw the first glow, we exhaled relief we hadn't known we were holding in. The new day offered a layer of safety, making the events of the night feel strangely dreamlike. My friend packed a few more things, and as he loaded them into his truck, he paused in the yard. I caught him staring at the cul-de-sac, probably thinking the same thing I was. Would we ever figure out what had been skulking out there? He drove away 2 days later, leaving me to face a weird mix of emptiness and lingering dread whenever I glanced out toward those fields. For a while, I tried to dismiss the memory of that night as a trick of fear and headlights. But whenever I passed that spot, where the asphalt ended and the desert began, the memory resurfaced, sharp and vivid. The possibility that the thing might still be waiting behind the brush never felt far-fetched anymore. A few months after he left, I left too, heading off to chase my own future. But whenever I come back to visit, those fields remain exactly the same. I'll drive by slowly, resisting the urge to scan the shadows, convinced that if I look too long, I might see a flash of pale skin, bony limbs, and that hollow grin. And no matter how much time passes, that possibility keeps me from feeling truly safe in the place I once called home. I remember paddling onto the shore of Little Triscuit as dusk settled in, feeling more worn out than usual. The day had been relentless, miles of open water, the sun beating down without mercy. Still, guiding trips at Lake of the Woods always brought a strange mix of excitement and wariness. Maybe it was the way the endless trees crowded the shoreline, or how legends around this place never stopped swirling among those who'd been here long enough. Whatever it was, I carried an edge of nervous energy with me as I helped unload the canoes. My co-guide, Jordan, and I had 7 campers with us, ranging from 12 to 17. One of them, let's call him Mark, rarely spoke in full sentences. When he did, the words sometimes tumbled out like he'd been bottling them up for days. I admired his determination to keep pace with everyone, but there was a look on his face that evening, almost like he wanted to tell me something, and couldn't quite get it out. While the others set up the tents and tried to scrape mud off their boots, I walked the perimeter of the campsite, taking note of the thick undergrowth beyond the fire pit. My gut told me to keep an eye on that shadowy border. Sunlight was fading fast, and the forest seemed to fold in around us. The moment I turned back to the main site, I spotted Mark standing at the edge of the trees, squinting into the dimness. "Who is that man?" he asked, voice flat. I stopped in my tracks and looked where he was pointing. No one was there except Jordan, busy tying down a canoe. I called out, "Mark, it's just us, buddy," and glanced around for any shape or movement. Nothing. We counted everyone, still 7 campers present. Mark just kept staring though, like he expected something to step out from behind a trunk at any second. Jordan caught sight of our uneasy conversation, and ambled over. I filled him in quickly, and we both assured Mark that maybe he was seeing a trick of the light. Mark didn't argue, but he didn't look convinced either. With everyone's stomachs growling, we decided to shift focus to dinner. We gathered around the campfire, the warmth of the flames cutting through the cool air. A few of the boys tried to lighten the mood by laughing at their own unfunny jokes, while our lone girl, Becca, stayed quietly by her tent. I felt a slight tension whenever someone glanced toward the tree line, especially Mark. It wasn't as if we'd actually seen anything, but the atmosphere felt heavy, like the forest was listening to every word. By the time we finished eating, darkness had swallowed the last traces of twilight. The lake glimmered under the moonlight, but the woods behind us looked like a solid wall. The group was spent. One by one, the kids peeled off to their tents. Jordan and I settled into ours, mentally ticking off safety measures before trying to rest. Hours later, or maybe it was just a long half hour, my eyes snapped open at the sound of Becca's voice. "Stop," she called, sounding annoyed. It came from a few yards away, where her tent was pitched. My pulse hammered as I scrambled for a flashlight. Jordan fumbled with the zipper and yelled back, "Becca, everything okay?" She didn't answer for what felt like an eternity, then muttered something we couldn't catch. We unzipped our tent and poked our heads out. Every other tent was zipped tight, no one wandering around. The breeze had vanished, leaving the campsite unnervingly silent. Finally, Becca's voice came again, low and shaky. "I thought you two were shaking my tent." Jordan and I looked at each other in confusion. We hadn't so much as budged since turning in. No one else had crawled out of their tents. I would have heard or seen a flashlight. Trying not to sound too freaked, I said, "We've been here the whole time." After that, Becca went quiet. The rest of the night passed without further commotion, but I doubt anyone slept well. Next morning, I expected everyone to be relieved in the broad daylight. Instead, nervous chatter replaced the usual morning groans about aches and pains from sleeping on the ground. Becca emerged from her tent flushed with frustration. "Look," she said, brandishing a bent tent stake in my face. I took it from her, puzzling over how it ended up twisted at a neat right angle. She had another one just like it. They were sturdy metal stakes, the kind that usually survive years of windstorms without bending. Jordan and I tried forcing one back into shape, but it may as well have been made of reinforced steel. It wouldn't budge. Becca insisted something had yanked on her tent, forcing the stakes to bend. She joked nervously that maybe she'd pitched her tent on top of an angry chipmunk den. Nobody really laughed. Breakfast tasted bland, even though I used the last of our precious cinnamon to spice up oatmeal. Everyone was eager to hit the canoes. Whatever happened here in the night, nobody wanted to stick around and find out if it would happen again. We double-checked our gear, then shoved off into the calm water. I glanced back over my shoulder at little Trisket, heart in my throat, half expecting to see a figure watching from the tree line. But there was just the dim shape of our campfire's ashes and a few drifting wisps of smoke. Jordan paddled alongside me, expression tense. We didn't say much. Even the kids, who usually bickered over who was the fastest, kept their voices low. Part of me tried to shrug it all off. Maybe it was just bizarre luck. Maybe we were all spooked by some trick of the light. but part of me couldn't shake the sense that Little Trisket wasn't a place you leave entirely behind. I kept that thought to myself for the moment, silently hoping that the next campsite would bring only ordinary wilderness troubles. Inside, though, I was already bracing for whatever else Lake of the Woods might have up its sleeve. By the time we finally shoved off from Little Trisket, the sky felt lighter, like we were leaving something behind in those tangled trees. Of course, none of us actually said that out loud. We just paddled, letting the kids' chatter fill the stillness. Every so often, Jordan and I exchanged glances that said, "Are we really done with all that?" Neither of us wanted to be the first to admit our nerves were still jangling. For the next couple of days, our group followed the usual canoe trail through smaller islands and calm coves. The mornings rolled by uneventfully. The kids sang rowing songs, teased each other about who needed more sunscreen, and occasionally complained about sore muscles. At night, though, my mind drifted back to those bent stakes, the trembling tent, things that didn't add up no matter how I tried to rationalize them. I caught Jordan scanning the tree lines more than once, as if half expecting some pale figure to glide into view. On the third day after leaving Little Trisket, we found a scenic campsite on the opposite side of the lake. It had a more open clearing, so at least we weren't surrounded by walls of undergrowth this time. The kids seemed relieved. They even built a small rock circle for the fire, humming pop tunes like they were back in civilization. At first I tried to match their mood, but each flicker of the flames made me remember the hush that fell over our group that first night, when Mark claimed he saw a man in the woods. That evening, the silence came down heavier than before. The wind died off, leaving the water still as glass. Once dinner ended, a couple of the kids tried to break the tension by telling jokes, but even those fizzled out. Jordan finally decided to spin one of the local legends, something about sightings of a gaunt shape roaming these shores, rumored to appear if you doubted its existence. The kids listened wide-eyed, glancing at the forest and the quiet water. I considered cutting him off, but he was already in full storyteller mode, describing how people sometimes woke to find their gear torn or footprints circling their tents. By the time he finished, every crackle of burning wood made the group jump. Mark, usually so quiet, spoke up then, murmuring about how the white shape only comes when people disrespect it. His voice was so subdued that everyone had to lean in. It felt like an echo from Little Trisket, and the memory left a knot in my chest. The rest of the night passed uneasily. I found myself jolting awake at every rustle beyond my tent, listening for footsteps that never came. A couple more days later, we finally made our way back to base camp. Seeing the row of cabins and hearing the bustle of other campers relaxed me a little, like stepping back into a world that obeyed normal rules. The kids scattered to retrieve their duffel bags, grinning at the promise of clean showers and phone signals. Jordan and I began our usual routine of hauling canoes onto racks and logging any equipment damage. But my mind was still replaying everything. Mark's warnings, the bent metal, Becca's shaken tent. Not long after we returned, I ran into a friend, another guide who'd stayed at Little Trisket the night after us. I asked her how the trip had gone, and she blurted out a strange story about seeing a tall, pale figure in the woods, while she was off finding a private spot to use the bathroom. She assumed it was some camper wandering too close, but when she got back, everyone insisted they'd been by the fire the whole time. I felt my stomach lurch. It was more or less the same thing we'd experienced. Someone or something lurking where it had no business being. That afternoon, word spread around camp about my conversation with her. Other guides tossed in their stories, each one more unnerving than the last. Footprints leading right to a tent door. Bizarre tapping on canvas in the dead of night. Muffled sounds echoing through the trees. One guy even swore he saw a faint shape slip into the water near an island rumored to be haunted. The common thread in all these tales was that once people returned to base camp, the weirdness stopped. It was almost like the forest itself refused to let outsiders scoff at its presence. I can't say I felt relief or terror as I listened to everyone's accounts. More a grim sense of acceptance. I realized that what happened to us wasn't just a fluke. Nobody used the word Wendigo openly, not in any serious way, but the older guides hinted at it in hushed tones. They'd shake their heads and say, "It's best to respect what you don't understand." Over the next few days, my thoughts kept drifting back to that night with the shaking tent and the twisted stakes, or to how Mark pointed straight into the darkness, convinced he saw a person out there. Sleep was erratic. Even casual noises, doors slamming or equipment rattling, made me think about snapping branches and hush-blanketed forests. Jordan and I tried to joke it off, but I could tell he was just as unsettled. At some point, I stood alone by the base camp canoe racks, and let my eyes wander across the horizon, where the lake merged with endless evergreens. Part of me wondered if I should take another trip out there, just to prove I wasn't spooked beyond reason. But another part of me answered, maybe give it time, and make sure you tread lightly if you ever go back. Right before heading in for the night, I glimpsed something along the tree line. Could have been just a shadow. Another guide waved me over to help with gear, and when I glanced back, nothing was there. I told myself it was a trick of the fading light. Still, an uneasy knot remained in my gut. The sense that something in those woods keeps its own watch, follows its own rules, and isn't keen on giving up its secrets. And I couldn't decide if I was more afraid of running into it again, or never knowing what was truly there in the first place. I swear I could feel the tension in the air the moment we hauled that gear onto the boat. The sun was just barely waking up, painting the sky in soft streaks of orange and pink as my dad and my brother wordlessly slid the boat into the water. Normally I would have been brimming with excitement for a trip like this, deep in northern Canada, searching for moose in a place that barely knew a human footprint. But something about that morning put me on edge. It was too quiet, too still. We spent hours gliding through winding rivers that twisted around thick walls of forest. Every so often, we'd have to stop at a cluster of rapids, lug our boat and supplies over slick rocks, then push forward again. My brother would occasionally crack a half joke about my scrawny arms not being up to the task, but there was an uneasy note to his voice. I just forced a laugh, pretending everything was fine. By late afternoon, it felt like the wind itself had abandoned us. We found a patch of muddy riverbank to set up camp. I remember letting out a relieved sigh as we anchored the boat and offloaded our gear. The forest around us loomed with silhouettes that almost looked like watchful figures, like the trees themselves were sizing us up. My dad shrugged it off when I tried to mention it. He just muttered about how we had to finish pitching the tent before we lost the last bit of daylight. When we finally settled by our modest campfire, my brother's usual chatter fell oddly flat. I tried asking him if he'd noticed anything strange while we were on the water, but he just shook his head and poked at the embers with a stick. Maybe he wanted to ignore it. Maybe I was being dramatic. But every now and then, I caught him glancing over his shoulder, checking the dark edges of the camp, as if expecting something to be there. Eventually, both my dad and brother decided to turn in for the night. I felt too restless, too uneasy to sleep. I told myself I'd collect more firewood, maybe shake off the day's weird energy. The campfire's glow only stretched so far, and as I moved beyond it, the air seemed to thicken. There was an odor, faint but nauseating, like expired food. My head felt light, like I couldn't quite keep my balance on the uneven ground. I crouched to pick up a stray branch, and that's when I caught a flicker of movement along the tree line. Something rustled. My heart hammered in my ears, a deep thrumming that drowned out every other sound around me. The moon was faint, just enough to tease shapes out of the darkness. I squinted, trying to see past a cluster of branches. It looked like they were bending, almost shifting in a way that resembled a face. My mind churned with explanations, maybe a trick of shadows, maybe a deer turning its head. But as I watched, that shape began to look disturbingly human. A voice drifted out from the dimness, startling me. It was warm, too warm, calling my name like it belonged to someone I loved. A voice I recognized immediately, but the relative it belonged to had been dead for months. My stomach lurched. Logic said this was impossible. Yet my feet inched forward. There was a gentle, pleading tone in that voice, asking me to come closer, that it missed me. My chest tightened with a flood of conflicting emotions. This was comforting and terrifying all at once. Everything changed in a single beat. The shape that had formed that too familiar face shifted. The skin, or whatever was imitating skin, started to peel, revealing a grotesque smear of muscle and bone. The mouth, once smiling, went slack. An overwhelming sense of alarm burned through me. I realized I had wandered far from the fire's protective glow. Whatever this thing was, it abandoned its facade and snarled, commanding me to move deeper into the dark. I stumbled backward, nearly losing my grip on the branches in my hand. I forced my body around and sprinted toward camp, but I heard it crashing behind me. The wild beating in my chest roared in my ears. The embankment leading up to the camp felt like a mile-high wall. I scrambled on all fours trying to climb. That's when it seized my ankle with a force that felt inhuman. A choked sound escaped my mouth at first, useless. Then, driven by pure desperation, I found my voice and managed a ragged scream for help, praying my dad or brother would hear. Suddenly, my brother appeared at the top of the slope, his eyes wide as he grabbed my arms and yanked me with everything he had. I could sense the creature's grip slipping, could practically feel the anger radiating from it in that final moment before it let go. We tumbled onto the dirt, gasping for air. My dad came racing out of the tent, rifle in hand, barking questions. Through shattered breaths, I tried describing what I saw, what I thought I saw. My brother cut me off with a quick nod, muttering that he caught a glimpse of it too. That confirmation, he saw it, froze my blood. I wanted to believe I was just hallucinating, but now there was no denying something nightmarish was out there. We stayed close to the fire, rifles drawn, scanning the edge of the woods for any sign of movement. The rest of the night stretched on like it would never end, every second charged with the fear of another attack. In the smoldering embers' glow, I couldn't get that rotting face out of my mind. An echo of a loved one's voice twisting into something monstrous. I had no idea if we'd truly escaped or if the worst was yet to come. I'd never felt so alive and so afraid at the same time. My chest was still hammering from the encounter by the riverbank, and as I stumbled back toward the fire with my brother's help, every shadow seemed ready to lash out again. My dad rushed over, rifle in hand, eyes darting from me to the dark tree line. I tried to explain, but my thoughts came out in jagged fragments. Something about a rotting face, torn skin, a voice that never should have spoken again. When I finally blurted that it sounded like our dead relative, the words tasted foul. Yet the worst part was that my brother nodded, confirming he'd caught a glimpse of the same horror. That small gesture meant there was no more pretending I'd imagined it. We crowded around the fire, almost huddling in a circle with our guns laid out within reach. The crackling flames were our only comfort, but they felt so fragile in that vast darkness. The silence was so heavy that every pop of burning wood made me jolt. My dad kept his gaze fixed on the tree line, scanning left and right, as if daring that thing to make a move. And the smell, the rancid, putrid stench that clung to the air, never faded. It drifted in and out as though something unholy was circling just beyond what the firelight revealed. Time dragged in that suffocating vigil. My brother and I didn't dare speak above a whisper, if at all. Every so often I swore I saw a tall silhouette flicker beyond the reach of the flames. It would stand there, looming, but when I'd blink or shift my angle, it vanished. I started to question my own eyes, my own sanity. Maybe it was just the aftershock of terror, but then my brother gripped his gun tighter, confirming he saw it too. We never did get a clear look. Part of me was thankful for that. I don't think I could handle seeing its face a second time. By the time the sky began to lighten, I felt half crazed with exhaustion. My eyes burned from keeping them open all night. But none of us had dared to sleep, not even for a moment. The embers of the fire were low, and the cold morning air made my breath rise in tense little clouds. I couldn't wait to pack up and tear away from that cursed spot. It felt like the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting for us to slip up. We broke camp with a kind of frantic efficiency I'd never seen before. My dad barked orders about rolling up sleeping bags and tossing them onto the boat. My brother didn't even crack a joke, his usual way of coping. He had this grim, distant look, as if he was already rehearsing a story he didn't want to share. I kept glancing over my shoulder, convinced that if I let my guard down for a second, that thing would lunge at me again. The stench still lingered in my nostrils, and I felt like my lungs couldn't draw in a full breath. When we finally shoved off, I could barely feel my hands. They trembled around the paddle, my palms slippery with sweat. The river seemed calmer than the day before, but I caught glimpses of motion along the banks, bony limbs darting between trees, or maybe just my imagination. Every time the boat scraped a shallow rock or driftwood, I panicked, thinking it was the creature grabbing hold again. My dad pressed us onward with a fierce urgency. We had to cover the distance back to civilization as fast as possible, or risk another night out here. Hours later, the scent of wood smoke and distant traffic lured us in, signs we were close to a small outpost. My entire body shook from the come-down, from that raw, gnawing terror. Yet the closer we got to actual homes and roads, the more my dread twisted into something else. A haunting certainty that I wouldn't truly leave this behind. I had no idea if that entity, or some piece of it, had followed us. There was no sense of safety in me, just a growing paranoia. Even back home, the nightmares took hold immediately. That very night, I jolted awake, convinced I heard shuffling footsteps on the porch, or scratching at my window. Sometimes, I'd dream of a half-decayed face calling me closer, rasping my name in a distorted version of my relative's voice. Morning would bring a flicker of relief, but it never lasted. Every knock on the door or rustle of wind made me jump. My brother wasn't any better off. He'd had the same kind of nightmares, though we didn't dare talk about it much. My dad, on the other hand, grew solemn, saying only that we mustn't breathe a word to anyone beyond a trusted few. He claimed nobody would believe us, and if they did, they'd call us reckless for wandering into places best left alone. Desperate for answers, we met with medicine men recommended by distant family friends. They performed rituals and offered small protective charms, sachets filled with herbs. For a few nights afterward, I managed to sleep a little longer before the nightmares got me. But that creeping feeling never went away. It clung to me like a damp chill, as though the entity had latched onto my spirit the moment it seized my leg. Finally, I chose to spill what I could to a couple of close friends. They gave me crystals, whispered about supernatural predators, and suggested I carry salt in my pockets whenever I headed out. I appreciated their concern, but I couldn't shake the sense that the only one who truly understood was my brother. Because he saw that thing too, if only for a split second. We all agreed to keep our story in a tight little circle. Part of it was shame, not wanting the label of crazy pinned on us. Part of it was guilt, like we'd trespassed somewhere we shouldn't have. And the forest spat back an unholy warning. Mostly, though, it was fear. Fear that in telling the story, we'd summon that decaying phantom all over again. Now, whenever I'm anywhere near the woods, I'm hyper-aware of every twig snap or drifting shadow. I never stand with my back to the trees anymore, because in the deepest part of my mind, I still smell that rancid stench and see a horrid grin under peeling skin, and I know it's out there, in one form or another, waiting for a moment of weakness. I made it out once, but something tells me this nightmare is far from over. I've been in this farmhouse my whole life, so nights out here usually feel familiar, almost comforting. You learn to tune out the usual creaks in the old wood, the distant lowing of cattle, and the soft chirping that drifts in through the windows. But that evening, something put me on edge. It started as I was going through my usual end-of-day routine. I was alone, so I felt a bit jumpier than usual. The living room lamp clicked off, leaving the space a lot darker than I remembered. The silence pressed in, and I headed to the front windows for my final pass, just to be sure everything was locked up. I nearly convinced myself I was being paranoid, when a faint glow caught my eye outside. At first I thought I was imagining it. 2 spots of light hovered near the tree line, too high off the ground to be a stray cat or a fox. I took off my glasses, rubbed my eyes, and looked again, but they were gone. My brain scrambled to come up with a rational explanation, maybe fireflies caught in a gust of wind, or a reflection of the moon on broken glass. Still, I made certain to lock every door and window before heading upstairs, heart thrumming a little harder than I'd care to admit. I didn't sleep well. Dawn arrived too fast, and I was already dragging myself out of bed to tend the animals. I hopped into my boots, stepped outside, and got hit with a stale, humid smell floating on the morning breeze. It felt wrong somehow, but I shoved that aside and focused on chores. My first stop was the barn. The horses were fine, just a bit restless. The real shock came when I checked on the cows. There were fewer than yesterday. I counted at least twice, but it didn't add up. Maybe I miscounted before, or maybe some had wandered off. That's when I noticed the fence. What used to be a sturdy section was torn and sagging, like something big and strong had barreled right through it. Splintered wood jutted at weird angles. I leaned in for a closer look and saw footprints in the dirt. They were strange, almost a hybrid shape, part hoof, part something else entirely. My family's taught me all about local wildlife, yet these tracks didn't match anything I'd seen or heard about. The uneasy feeling I'd had the night before started creeping back. I checked the rest of the property, finding no other clues, so I tried to move on, patching the fence as best I could until I had help. As the day dragged on, I found it tough to focus. My phone lit up with a text from my girlfriend, and the conversation blew up into a full-on fight. It left me tense and itching to clear my head. So after dusk, I grabbed my phone and headphones, heading off toward the forest. I've hiked it 1,000 times, but this was different. Something about the night air felt oppressive, like it was charged. I cranked up my music to overpower my thoughts and wandered deeper than I intended. Before I knew it, darkness was everywhere. I flipped on my phone's flashlight, sweeping it around. I caught the reflection of something that looked like eyes in the beam, high behind a tree. As soon as I angled my phone that way, the reflection vanished, leaving me reeling from a rush of panic. Maybe it was a trick of the light again, or maybe not. A growl rippled through the trees, low and ragged, unlike anything I'd heard in these woods. The hairs on the back of my neck prickled, and I realized I had no clue where the path went. I started to backtrack, stumbling over roots and tangling my boots in undergrowth. My flashlight shook with each step. Then a sharp snap, like a branch being crushed underfoot, sounded close, too close. Fear surged in my chest. I had to get out. My jog turned into a full-on sprint, branches slapping my face and arms. When I finally saw the farmhouse lights in the distance, I breathed a silent prayer of relief. I hopped the broken fence, nearly face-planting on the other side. Something moved at the tree line, tall, menacing, with eyes that gleamed faintly in the dark. A vile odor hit me, intense enough to make me gag. It never advanced. It just stood there, watching with a stillness that felt deliberate, like it was studying me. I forced myself inside, slammed the door, and locked it. My heart hammered as I peeked out a window, only to glimpse that pair of eyes still trained on me. Enough was enough. I yanked the blinds down, shut off every light, and made my way to my room, grabbing the old shotgun from my closet just to steady my nerves. That night, sleep was a distant thing. My thoughts were in a whirl, cows disappearing, fences torn, footprints with no reasonable explanation, and a hulking silhouette crouched at the edge of my land. I tried to convince myself I'd wake up and find a neat explanation, but I knew, deep down, that something big and unknown was stalking these woods. I woke the next morning with the shotgun still clutched in my arms, feeling like I'd only dozed off in brief intervals. The sun was out, but it did nothing to chase off the dread tightening my chest. I dragged myself outside to survey the damage. Sure enough, another cow was gone. The fencing I'd patched was shredded again. Splinters littered the ground, and I spotted crimson smears on the wire that looked too fresh to be old stains. There were footprints too, the kind I had no name for. Long, deformed impressions that seemed part hoof, part something far more disturbing. I forced myself deeper into the pasture, shotgun ready. It felt ridiculous. But every rustle in the grass, every flutter of a bird made me jump. The forest stood ominously just beyond the fields, an unspoken invitation for this thing to come and go at will. Despite the daylight, I sensed I wasn't alone. Frustration and anger flared inside me. I'd lived here all my life, and no unknown creature was going to claim this land as a feeding ground. I mustered enough nerve to stand at the tree line, hollering into the undergrowth that I wasn't afraid. My voice shook, and the echo that returned from the stillness was unnerving. For a split second I thought I saw a black shape slip between the trunks, but whether it was the thing itself or just my imagination, I had no intention of finding out. I half-jogged back to the farmhouse, all the while feeling that same prickling sense of being watched. That afternoon, I did everything I could think of to prepare. I scavenged the barn for nails, boards, and tools, then rigged makeshift barricades on the windows. It felt a little excessive, but the memory of those eyes peering at me the night before kept me hammering away. I stacked furniture against certain doors I never used, bracing them from the inside. The place looked more like a fortress with each passing hour, and I hated that I needed this level of security in my own home. As dusk crept closer, I patrolled the house again, triple-checking every lock. The air outside turned heavy, and the wind rustled the dead leaves near the fence. It carried a faint, sickly smell that made my stomach churn. I couldn't shake the sense that it was out there, sizing me up, waiting for darkness to hide its advance. Night finally fell, and with it, the usual forest noises vanished. No crickets, no frogs, just an unsettling quiet that set me on edge. My muscles tensed with every step across the old floorboards. I turned off most of the lights, leaving a few dim lamps so I could see if anything moved outside. My shotgun was within arm's reach, and I had a pistol holstered at my hip just in case. A few hours crawled by in suffocating silence. I thought maybe, just maybe, I'd overdone it. That's when a sudden crash rattled the front door. The force behind the blow echoed through the house. My mouth went dry, and my heart thundered in my ears. Another crash. The door frame quaked, and I heard glass pop and skitter across the floor somewhere downstairs. A low roar rose from behind the walls, so feral and strange that I felt the vibrations in my chest. Something was forcing its way in, and my body reacted before my brain caught up. I snatched the shotgun and scrambled upstairs, nearly tripping on the last step. In the hallway, each footstep of the intruder felt heavier than any human's. The boards creaked as if under the weight of something colossal. An overpowering stench drifted toward me, thick enough to taste. I covered my nose with my sleeve, trying not to retch. Then came the banging on the door to my room. Loud, rhythmic hits that shattered my nerve. Splinters of wood flew as I shouldered the door, shoving a dresser into place to buy a few seconds. The door buckled, and I finally caught sight of it. The crack between the door and frame gave me a horrible glimpse. Matted fur, something like a deer's skull topped with twisted antlers, but with patches of rotting skin clinging to it. My hands shook as I racked the shotgun's first shell. I aimed. The door burst open, sending shards of wood everywhere. I fired. The muzzle flash lit up the creature's hideous features. Empty eyes set in decaying sockets, an open maw with a jaw that seemed off-kilter. It let out a horrible screech that made me recoil, then lunged. I fired again, the recoil slamming back into my shoulder, but I refused to let go. The thing staggered, leaking a dark, foul substance that smelled like death. It howled, flailing those long limbs in fury. I kept my finger on the trigger, racking another shell, firing, and doing it again until I was spent. Each shot was deafening, and the house trembled with every roar from that abomination. Finally, it staggered backward, wheeling around in confusion. It tore down part of the hallway as it fled, smashing through walls and overturning furniture in its escape. I grabbed my pistol, sprinting after it down the stairs. My heart hammered, but adrenaline pushed me forward. The front door, the very one it had battered in, now stood ripped off its hinges. Outside, the shape lumbered across the yard. Its outline was monstrous, lit by a flickering porch light. With a trembling grip, I squeezed off a few rounds. The bullet seemed to do little more than anger it further. It whipped its head back, unleashing a final roar that reverberated off the barn, then bounded into the forest shadows. I wanted to chase it, but the rational side of me knew that was suicide. I called out a string of curses, equal parts terrified and furious, watching it vanish between the looming trees. Then there was sudden silence, broken only by my ragged breathing. Even the wind had died, leaving the yard unnaturally still. My front door was on the ground, the hinges twisted. Inside I discovered the windows, where I swore I'd heard glass explode, were strangely intact, as if reality had split for a moment, and then stitched itself back together, leaving evidence only in the wrecked wood and bullet casings scattered at my feet. I leaned against the splintered frame, shotgun and pistol hanging limply in my hands, trying to piece everything together. I stayed that way for what felt like hours, until I realized I had to come up with a believable story for my parents. There was no way to explain giant claw marks or bullet holes that made any sense. I finally decided to say I'd lost my temper during a personal crisis, blowing holes in the door myself. A story that wouldn't earn me any points, but at least it wouldn't brand me a lunatic. By the time morning came, I was exhausted, but the house and yard were eerily calm. Stains on the floor had vanished. The only real reminder of the battle was my ruined door and the crippling weight in my chest. The phone rang soon after. My folks checking up on me. I lied as smoothly as I could about the door, promising to fix it before they got home. They threatened to ground me for the rest of my life, but that was a relief compared to explaining the truth. Time marched on, and I eventually left for college, but every so often I'd check in with my family, ask if the cows were all accounted for, if the fences were intact, if they'd heard any strange howls in the night. They'd brush it off as me worrying too much, but they didn't know the whole story. Part of me stayed convinced that whatever I fought off that night is still out there, licking its wounds, waiting. And the thought of going back to that farm alone still manages to send a sharp bolt of dread through my gut every time. I started out late, just a little after 10, and the sky was pouring rain like it was determined to drench every inch of Bucks County. Not the best conditions, but I'd driven these roads 100 times. I guess that's why I barely thought twice as I pulled onto the highway. Just the usual annoyance of wet tires and too few streetlights to really see more than a patch of asphalt ahead. The wipers were working overtime, swiping at the windshield so fast it was almost hypnotic. Part of me wanted to pull over and wait it out, but another part insisted I'd be fine. Besides, I was only about 45 minutes from home, and the idea of relaxing in my own bed kept me forging ahead. I shrugged off the creeping sense of dread, blaming it on the weather. A quarter hour into the drive, I found myself scanning the darkness on either side, maybe because I've seen deer dart out at the worst moments before. This time, though, I noticed something looming in my lane, way off in the distance. The shape seemed too big to be a normal deer. Way too tall, almost giraffe-like in the way it stretched upward. My pulse hammered at the base of my throat as I lifted my foot off the gas. I wondered if my eyes were just playing tricks, but it was definitely there, a shadow that swallowed any light from my high beams, refusing to reflect a single shimmer. I kept easing on the brakes, worried that a sudden stop might make me spin out. The car wobbled a bit, tires skidding on the slick surface. A few hundred feet away from this thing, I glanced down at my speedometer and realized I was going faster than I thought. Letting out a shaky breath, I gripped the wheel tighter, gearing up for an impact I half expected. I blinked rainwater from my lashes, forcing myself to keep my attention on the road. Getting closer, the figure started flickering at the edges like it couldn't decide whether to be there or not. Water pelted the windshield and the wipers made a groaning noise as they whipped back and forth, but somehow that shape stayed outside the range of my headlights. My vision blurred for a split second. I fiddled with the lever, turning the wipers to max, and still I couldn't get a clear view. Before I could comprehend it, the silhouette vanished. One moment, I was about to face down some huge creature. The next, I saw only empty asphalt glistening in the wet glare of my high beams. My shoes pressed harder on the brakes, and the car shuddered to a stop in the middle of the highway. I let out a ragged exhale, scanning the road ahead, the ditches on either side. Nothing. A car behind me honked far off, probably still a good distance away, so I tapped the gas and forced myself forward. Rain hammered against the roof, and I muttered a few curses under my breath, half convinced I'd imagined everything. That's when something smaller dashed right in front of my grill. There was no time to brace for impact. It popped into view and shot across the road in the blink of an eye. My chest tightened, ready for a thud, a lurch, anything. But I felt nothing. The road stayed clear, and the only sound was the whoosh of water under my tires. For a few seconds I thought I might be losing my mind. I eased the car down to a crawl, glancing in my rearview mirror, fully expecting to see a writhing body on the pavement. Still no sign of anything, no carcass, no shape scurrying off into the trees, nothing. It was like the road had swallowed it. The remaining half-hour home was a blur. Every flicker of movement, branches swaying, puddles splashing, made me jump. By the time I parked, my hands ached from gripping the steering wheel. I rushed inside and told the story to my boyfriend on the phone, practically tripping over my own words. He tried to calm me down, said maybe it was just the bad weather and my eyes playing tricks, but I could tell he was spooked by how shaken I sounded. That night, I barely slept. I kept thinking about that towering silhouette and the smaller phantom that zipped past my car. Normal deer sightings don't make me feel this unsteady. I had no idea what I'd run into out there, and the not knowing was the worst part. All I wanted was an explanation that made sense, but I also dreaded the thought that this was only the beginning of something bigger, and far more frightening. I woke up way too early, eyes gritty from a night of tossing and turning. Even in the bright morning light, I couldn't get rid of the images swirling in my head, those silhouettes that appeared and vanished during my drive. It had me on edge in a way I've never felt before. Normally, I'd grab breakfast and scroll social media for a while, but that morning, I found myself hunched over my phone, searching every corner of the internet for some logical explanation. Deer collisions, weird reflection issues, illusions caused by rain. They all popped up, yet none matched what I'd experienced. Some people online talked about cryptids, discussing Wendigos or shapeshifters. Honestly, I wasn't sure if I believed in any of that. Still, the descriptions, creatures that didn't reflect light properly, animals that stood unnaturally tall, left me more uneasy. It felt like one of those rabbit holes you fall down when you're desperate for answers, but every new sentence I read made the memory worse. Rather than comfort, I got a deeper sense that the roads I'd always considered home turf might be hiding something I couldn't begin to understand. By the time I shut off my phone, the sun was well above the rooftops, and I realized I was going to be late for work if I didn't hurry. I forced myself into a quick shower, hoping hot water would jolt me awake enough to function. My reflection in the bathroom mirror was more pallid than usual, eyes ringed with exhaustion. I couldn't bring myself to dwell on it too long because I knew if I stared too hard, I might talk myself into calling out sick. Stepping outside, I noticed how normal everything seemed. The sky was a bright blue, last night's puddles evaporating in small wisps off the asphalt. Neighbors were driving off on daily routines, no one looking even remotely disturbed. Part of me wished I could blend into that normalcy, just push last night into some forgotten corner of my mind. It was tough to do that though, when every time I blinked, I imagined that warped creature was waiting behind my eyelids. I hopped into my car, feeling my chest tighten when I reached for the ignition. The memory of gripping the steering wheel in the dark, bracing for a collision that never happened, came rushing back. But it was broad daylight now, so it had to be safer, right? I tried to convince myself of that as I pulled out of the driveway. Work was only 10 minutes away, a drive filled with school zones and traffic lights. No lonely highways where horrifying shapes might materialize. As I cruised through town, I caught myself glancing at every patch of grass along the sidewalk, almost expecting to see a deer-like silhouette behind every tree. Nothing out of the ordinary showed up, yet my nerves remained on alert. When I finally arrived at work, I breathed a small sigh of relief. Being around coworkers and busy tasks offered a distraction. I was able to shove those thoughts aside for a handful of hours, losing myself in the mundane swirl of emails and phone calls. But every so often, while staring at my computer screen, I'd remember the flickering edges of that shadow. It would replay in my mind, an uninvited loop. After clocking out, I knew I couldn't hide indoors forever. Groceries were running low, and I needed gas, so I decided to swing by a store on the outskirts of town. The drive there felt normal enough. Bright sun, mild traffic, folks moving along. But as soon as I left the more congested roads and turned onto a quieter stretch that skirted a patch of woods, my heartbeat started hammering. The trees weren't thick enough to truly block out the sun, but the overhang of branches dappled the road in shadows. I noticed how they seemed to shift with each gust of wind, and it was impossible not to recall that ephemeral silhouette from last night. Just as I crested a small hill, a deer stepped out from the brush. This was definitely a real one. Normal height, regular fur, ordinary antlers. Yet something about its posture made me slow down. It locked eyes with me through the windshield. For a split second, I swore it recognized me. Rationally, I knew that was absurd. How would a deer recognize me specifically? But its stare was unwavering, and I felt pinned there, as if an invisible string tugged between us. My hand shook on the wheel, and I barely remembered to tap the brakes as it casually ambled across the pavement. Once it reached the other side, it paused, head slightly turned, still watching. Without making a sound, I pressed the gas, rolling forward at a crawl, not daring to take my eyes off it until it was out of sight. Nothing about that brief exchange should have been remarkable, but it left me rattled. Eventually, I finished shopping and headed home, groceries rattling in the back seat. I tried to laugh it off, getting spooked by a typical deer in broad daylight. It still made my chest tighten though, because I felt a certain awareness in that encounter, like it was reminding me of the shapes I'd seen just hours before. When I finally got back, I felt strangely drained, like I'd run a marathon even though I'd only run errands. That evening, I settled onto the couch with my phone, determined to find something, anything, that would help me handle this situation. My boyfriend texted me, asking how I was holding up, and I spilled my thoughts in a long, rambling reply. He brought up the idea of a dash cam, and I quickly realized he was right. If there was something strange out there, maybe I could capture it. That possibility sent a shiver of dread through my whole body. Did I really want proof that these shadows existed? But ignoring them didn't feel like an option anymore. I ended up reading through product reviews and ordering one that promised high-quality night footage. The second I hit the confirm button, it felt like I'd crossed a line. I was inviting a confrontation with the unknown. After that, I walked around my living room, clicking off lamps, flipping them back on, anything to keep myself occupied. It was just about sunset, and I noticed how the clouds were shifting into thick masses of gray. Another storm was brewing. I glanced out the window, staring down the darkening street. Houses glowed with porch lights, and cars passed lazily. But the storm clouds made me think of last night's downpour. In the pit of my stomach, I sensed that something waited for nightfall. My phone buzzed with a text, my friend wanting me to hang out, but the thought of driving after sundown made me hesitate. Eventually, I replied that I wasn't feeling up to it. I tried to ignore the wave of anxiety that simple decision caused, but I knew I was changing my routine out of fear. Before bed, I kept checking the shipping status of my dashcam like it was some lifeline. I stared at the clock, measuring each passing minute against the deepening gloom outside. Rain started tapping at the windows again, not nearly as fierce as last time, but enough that it brought back flashes of how it felt to be caught in that downpour on the highway. My stomach twisted in knots, and I gripped the edge of the table, half expecting to see a tall silhouette cross the yard, or another smaller creature zip by the corner of my vision. Nothing moved, except for the occasional flicker of headlights from a passing car. By the time midnight rolled around, I was wide awake, senses so sharp that the ticking clock in the kitchen sounded like a drumbeat. The forecast promised heavier rain later in the week. The idea of driving in those conditions again made my heart pound. I wished I could just bury myself under blankets and never leave the house until I had that dash cam rolling. But life would go on, and I couldn't avoid the roads forever. From my window, I watched as the sky finally split open in a drizzle. Droplets bounced off the pavement, reflecting the streetlight's dull glow. Somewhere beyond that thin curtain of water, I felt a presence. Was it just paranoia, a leftover fear from a single terrifying drive? I didn't have an answer. What I did know was that everything in my life seemed different now. Like I'd stepped into a reality where the rules had shifted slightly off-center. Tomorrow, I'd have to face another day, possibly another drive, and sooner or later I'd be out there at night again. As the rain fell, I wondered if those silhouettes were out in the darkness, waiting for the next chance to appear, and I couldn't decide which possibility scared me more, the idea that it was all in my head, or that every bit of it was real. Thank you for staying with me until the end. I hope tonight's stories kept you company in the dark. Sleep well, and if you enjoyed this, don't forget to subscribe. Good night, and see you in the next one.